I hope you enjoyed lunch. We're going to start now with our keynote speaker, Dr. Cecilia Morgan, who is a professor at OISE at the University of Toronto, and she's a social and cultural historian of education in Canada with, quote, I'm going to quote from her website, research interests in the areas of gender, colonialism, and imperialism, the writing of Canadian history at popular level in 19th and 20th century Ontario, but also the links between gender, middle-class formation, and national identities. In 2002, she co-authored with colleague Coates the book Heroines in History, Representations of Madeleine de Verchères and Laura Secord, which, quote, examines the gendered formation of historical memory in 19th and 20th century Quebec and Ontario by comparing and contrasting the images of Madeleine and Laura. Today, she's going to explore with us gender in the War of 1812 in Upper Canada, history, memory, and commemoration.
Thank you, Alison. Well, I'd like to thank the Ontario Women's History Network for inviting me here today. It was a real treat to hear the papers this morning, and I'm looking forward to the session this afternoon as well. And I'd like to thank Alison for being my organizer, helping me get here. I guess I was thinking about this before the conference, and I often tell my students that historians make particularly lousy futurists. Very bad at predicting the future. And I certainly have to include myself in that group of lousy futurists because my thesis, which I wrote in the late 80s and early 90s, had a chapter on the War of 1812 and the gendered nature of patriotic and political discourse in Upper Canada. And then, as Alison said, I went on to write about Laura Secord's Commemoration and Representations. And I never dreamed that there would be any interest at all in these particular areas. I didn't see 2012 coming, and I must confess. It was not on my particular radar. So that may be just a reflection of my own deficiencies as a person living in the here and now. But and the other part of this I should mention is that I also live in Niagara-on-the-Lake. I teach at the University of Toronto, but I live in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And of course, there is no escaping the commemoration of the War of 1812 in that particular area right now. And it's actually, for me, it's quite fascinating in so many ways. And it also gives me a bit of an opportunity to do a little bit of work as a public historian, which I find really interesting and gratifying as well. So, the spring of 1812 in the village of Queenston was a pleasant, if busy, time for Augusta Jarvis McCormick. Writing to her father, William Jarvis, a loyalist and member of the colonial government, McCormick opened her letter by begging his pardon for so long delaying to write to, explaining that her domestic duties had kept her from putting pen to paper. Perhaps a recent gift of asparagus that he'd sent had prompted a twinge of daughterly guilt, as she made sure to thank him for the very fine and very acceptable vegetables. McCormick also sent other domestic news, such as the birth of her sister's son, a neighbour's gout, and the sending of a cake from Queenston to her father's home in York, the colony's capital. McCormick looked forward to a peaceful summer, with her days shaped by domestic duties and delights. Babies, small children. Sorry, they're interested in history. That makes me happy. Babies, asparagus, cakes, and a landscape that looked like a flower garden. Yet her letter also hinted that Queenston was not immune from the transatlantic world of war and colonial expansion of the early 19th century. Almost buried in a discussion of Thomas's recovery from enslavement was the news the general arrived yesterday. McCormick also asked her father to tell her brother William that she had heard a sad tale of his growing to an immense size in the receipt of his commission. The general was the British Major General Isaac Brock, the civil and military commander of Upper Canada. And less than 6 months after McCormick wrote her father, Brock would die close to McCormick's home at the Battle of Queenston Heights. Moreover, McCormick's tranquil village in the Niagara area would see some of the fiercest and most destructive land battles of the War of 1812. Now, Upper Canada, as we've heard in various ways today, was drawn into transatlantic conflicts because of its colonial status. Seen as an impediment to American political and economic expansion, By 1811, British North America became the target of those American politicians who sought to take advantage of Britain's preoccupation with European conflicts, and who also believed that an invasion, particularly of Upper and Lower Canada, would secure the legacy of the American Revolution. Upper Canadians were thus at the mercy of larger imperial struggles. But that's not the only way of thinking about the War of 1812, although it is an important one. For example, historian Alan Taylor has recently characterized the war as it was fought in the Canadas as a civil war, one fought between those who'd either migrated to the US or joined the British Army in their homeland, and between indigenous peoples, also separated from each other in many ways because of the American Revolution. Taylor's arguments about such ties and characterizing the war in this way, I think, are well taken, as is his point of seeing it as part of a continuum of colonial, imperial, and national conflicts, not a discrete and self-contained event. But if it was a civil war, in many ways it also was a domestic one, and I just want to say a few words here because we've heard so much in many rich ways this morning about that. This war had very tangible and direct effects on the daily lives and experiences of men, women, and children, whether they were of British, European, or African Canadian descent. This wasn't a war that was fought on so-called foreign soil, unlike the South African or the World Wars. And moreover, the War of 1812, as we heard earlier this morning, had particular meanings for Indigenous people in the colony, especially the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people who fought alongside British troops in the colonial militia. And in many ways, there are historians who argue that the war was a central turning point in their histories. The war wasn't only experienced as crops burned, homes looted, and loved ones maimed and killed. The conflict bequeathed a legacy to colonial political culture, as it also played a significant role in which Ontarians came to think of themselves over the course of the 19th century. For example, participation in the War of 1812 became an important means of helping to define who could and who could not claim patriotism, virtue, and loyalty to Britain. Equally importantly, though, the memory of the war, as captured in the work of the novelist John Richardson in the 1840s, and in that of Niagara historian Janet Carnahan in the late Victorian and Edwardian years, relied on associations and relationships between the domestic and the political realms. The war was remembered and commemorated as a significant military and political event in the colony's history, but it was one that also encompassed the domains of the intimate and the familial. I just want to say a few words about the colonial context before I move into the post-war period. And again, some of this has been discussed in more detail this morning. Now, when Augusta Jarvis McCormick wrote of babies, cakes, and asparagus, she did so in a context in which pronouncements, and here I'm talking about public pronouncements, of patriotism, loyalty, and honest manliness helped define the political realm as the domain of the loyal male British subject. A realm that took particular strength and meaning from comparisons to the very bad examples set by the republics to the south and across the oceans, where in France in particular it was argued by various members of the colony's elite. Sexual licentiousness and female domination in particular had paved the road to republican godlessness and immorality, so blaming women, using the figure of women as reasons for this slide into degeneracy. Such themes, loyalty, patriotism, and the defense of the colony by patriotic men, became increasingly popular with the war's outbreak. But the militia's bold manliness, and there was a lot written about the assumptions that the militia would behave in such a way, when exposed to the exigencies of battle, might become prey to the bestial forces that had undermined and degraded their opponents. How to prevent the qualities that might guarantee success in battle from becoming licentious wantonness, as writers were fond of dubbing it, in its aftermath. Something more was needed as a unifying symbol of manly self-sacrifice and decency under wartime duress: the Christian soldier and his real-life embodiment, Major General Isaac Brock. If the Christian soldier, discussed in sermons, public pronouncements, and so on, if the Christian soldier was too abstract a symbol, then Brock, a respected outsider who had not been part of the political squabbles that marked the pre-war years, could be and was invoked as his flesh and blood incarnation. His death at Queenston Heights in October of 1812 provided those who shaped ideas about patriotism with an unassailable symbol, they thought: a courageous Christian soldier who sacrificed himself for his country. We'll talk a little bit more about Brock in the pre-war, post-war period. He also emphasized and epitomized the morality displayed in both the domestic realm, love for his family, his fraternal affection for his sister, not the fiancée, but the sister, and on the battlefield. Now, symbols of patriotic womanhood during the war years did not emerge to complement or rival that box. As we've heard this morning, white upper Canadian women were not completely absent from wartime demonstrations of patriotism and loyalty, nor did their acts in support of British forces go completely unmentioned in military communiques and letters. Women might have interposed their bodies to help British troops in local skirmishes, for example. There's a few examples in William Hamilton Merritt's correspondence about this. Or in a few cases, they were lauded as acting as smugglers and spies, and of course Lord Seacourt is the best-known example of the latter. These sources, as well as other kinds of records, remind us that this was a war that at times, yes, was fought quite literally on the colonists' doorsteps. And moreover, the military itself was not strictly a man's world. In dispatches and letters, British military officials discussed the evacuation of women and children from the British garrisons and worked out allowances for soldiers' wives and families. And wives might not have been the only women at the garrison. In his general orders, issued at Kingston on the 14th of July in 1813, Adjutant General E. Baines notified the 89th Regiment that Captain Basden had been relieved of his command for allowing several instances of irregularity and misconduct. Not least of these irregularities was the fact that Basden, and here I'm quoting Baines, in violation of all regard to decency and decorum, encumbered the brigade of boats by bringing up under his protection a female of improper character. But despite all of this, though, the image of terrified and helpless women in need of manly protection was a far more common theme in images and representation produced publicly about the war. And until Seacourt's story became popularized, along those with other pioneer and United Empire Loyalist women in the late 19th century, this image is generally the one you find in many of the public post-war accounts. Now, perhaps it's not overly surprising that the war was cast in those terms, with the militia and British troops taking the central role in its narrative, and white colonial women, Indigenous people, and to a much lesser extent, African Canadians being allowed brief appearances in which they played suitable supporting roles. The colony's founders, after all, stressed the need to maintain hierarchy and patriarchal order as a way of avoiding another American Revolution. But I think it's interesting to contrast Upper Canada with other military contexts. In other conflicts, and ones that would have been for a number of colonists within living memory, white colonial womanhood had been mobilized to support national causes, such as the displays of patriotic women spinning and their boycott of British goods during the American Revolution. Although Upper Canadian writings on patriotism and loyalty did not mention this history of Republican women's activities, perhaps the very memory helped ensure that images of femininity were generally limited to helplessness and besieged innocence, so that military manhood and those men who were the bearers of its virtues remained at the center of patriarchal discourse. But on the other hand, I think it's a little bit interesting to think about the fact that in a context in which colonial officials felt a certain uneasiness about loyalty, it's somewhat surprising that more was not made of white women's support of the imperial time. Now to the legacies of the war. While the War of 1812 lasted barely 3 years, the colony felt its aftermath in multiple ways in political culture, and as I mentioned earlier, it helped inform and shape debates and discussions over the direction the colony should take and who should lead it. And women weren't, again, not entirely absent from public claims of wartime service. As Maria told us this morning, they might put forward their claims of service to the Crown to support requests for government petitions or pensions, and such was the case in Seacourt's series of petitions that she began to file in the 1820s, requesting that support for her disabled husband, herself, and a large family of daughters. Yet the war's public memory, the structures of official commemoration, focused on battlefields and Isaac Brock. As Patricia Jason's study of early 19th century tourism in Ontario has demonstrated, Lundy's Lane, Fort George, and other Niagara area battlefields were, aside from Niagara Falls, some of the colony's earliest tourist attractions. As well, tributes to Brock were composed both during the war and afterwards, in poetry recited at school examinations, in the twice-built Queenston Monument, in memorial services that commemorated the Battle of Queenston Heights, and in early textbooks. The war was also the subject of John Richardson's The Canadian Brothers or the Prophecy Fulfilled, a tale of the late American War. Born in probably either Queenston or Fort George, we're not entirely sure, in 1796, Richardson's father, Robert, was a British military surgeon, and his mother was Madeline Askin, and we've heard about the Askin family this morning. He fought for the British from 1812 to 1813 and saw considerable battle action on both sides of the border, although this ended when he was taken prisoner at the Battle of Moraviantown in 1813 and sent to Kentucky. On his release at the war's end, Richardson served in Europe and in the West Indies. He also spent time in Paris and London in the 1820s and 30s, and he returned to Upper Canada's Western District to help suppress the rebellion of 1837. A series of misfortunes, I won't go into the details of them, but some of them involved financial misfortunes, some of them involved familial problems. During the 1840s in Canada West, saw Richardson depart for the United States in 1849, and he arrived in New York City in 1852. But as well as his military career, Richardson was a well-published novelist and journalist, and quite prolific. He published a number of narratives of the War of 1812 in a series of articles that were then turned into a textbook in 1842. But for now, I'd like to actually talk about the novel. Now, The Canadian Brothers was first published in 1840 in Montreal and was intended as a sequel to his earlier tale, the 1832 novel